Having examined the extent of our discussion so far on organizational and administrative theory, it is pertinent for one to observe that the role of the human being in the formation of an organization and in the establishment of the principles and practices and in the actualization of the goals and objectives of an organization revolves around the individual or the personnel of an organization. Ranging from the theories discussed so far, there's no gainsaying that the human being that forms the organizational staff strength to a large extent plays a very dominant role in determining the extent of the successes that the organization records. All theories, both from the simplistic and mechanistic approach as laced in the traditional theory of organization and administration, have also upheld the emphasis of the relevance of the role of individuals. Then its metamorphosis to the more complex organizational setup as encapsulated in the behavioral pattern equally reveals the extent to which the role of the individual reigns supreme when one discusses issues of organization and the extent to which administration is played out within the confines of an organization. And in all this, it therefore means that for any organization to make progress or to succeed, the role of the individual, the extent of the confidence the individual have within the system to a large extent must reign supreme. So having said that, in today's discussion, we shall be looking at issues of morale, conduct, and discipline within the service. But before now, it is pertinent that we take a retrospective analysis of what we have discussed so far, ranging from the aspects of the scientific management theory, to the extent of the behavioral theory, to the extent of the formation of organizations themselves, the structures of organizations, and then the various relevance of the structure of organization, ranging from the extent to which there is a comparison between private enterprise and public enterprises, and the roles of each of these enterprises that we have discussed so far is equally relevant in every discussion that one directs towards how organization functions and the roles that they perform. In the course of our lectures, we also looked at issues of centralization and decentralization. We have looked at the extent to which the role of the individual, even when it entails experimental practices to show that the individual to a large extent plays very dominant role in the extent to which organization functions, have all been captured and encapsulated in the lectures before now. So in it all, the extent to which the individual functions, the social interactions that take place, and the rules and regulations that guide these interactions to a large extent determines the extent of the input and output that an organization is faced with. And that brings the issues of morale. In an organization where the morale is low, there's no gainsaying that the output will be low, or the levels of involvement and participation will be low. An organization where the emphasis is on productivity alone to the detriment of the welfare of the worker is one where the morale is definitely low. The extent of the conduct of the personnel within this organization will be low. The extent of the discipline would equally be low, and productivity at the end of the day would be at its lowest ebb. It is only normal for one to lay so much emphasis on the relevance of the conduct of the staff or the personnel that make up an organization. And when that comes to play, the extent of the reward system within the organization also determines the extent of the input of the worker within such an organization. So it is only normal for one to understand that organizations where the extent of the morale level is high is one where productivity will equally be high, and vice versa. So the issues of morale, the issues of conduct, the issues of discipline that takes place within an organization to a large extent determines the extent of the successes that can be recorded within such an organization. And in today's lecture, our emphasis would be on the civil service. So having said that, I would be sharing my screen with you so that you have a fair idea of what our discussion of today would be centering on. We have it here, moral conduct and discipline, and we said that for public administration to be successful, it must give up the dead mechanistic theory of organization and should adopt a dynamic, creative theory of public management based on human motivation. This goes further to buttress the point made earlier that at best it can be described as hypocritical if an organization does not pay attention to the extent of the comfortability of the personnel that work in this organization, but expects results at the end of the day. So for every extent of productivity that can be pursued within the confines of an organization, it therefore means that the role of the individual, the extent of the creativity, the extent of the conduct and discipline and morale that the individual is faced with or is available for the individual to a large extent determines the extent of the successes that can be recorded. So what this theory is saying is that there should be a departure from the traditional legalistic and mechanistic approach of organization, that emphasis is placed on productivity alone to the detriment of the welfare of the individual, to the new theories that are laced within the behavioral perspective that reflects the conduct of the human being as the central point of productivity and successes that can be recorded within an organization. In other words, there should be a departure from the earliest theories of organization where emphasis is on productivity alone to the place where the human being ascends the central role of productivity in itself, and the concern is on the human being and the extent of the motivation that the human being has in the production, in the chain of production. So having said that, the civil service should become a team of fellow workers sustained by a high morale and code of ethics. The secret of the outstanding success of the British civil service is its high morale built up by the civil servants themselves. So within the confines of this discussion, it is only normal for one to conceive of the idea that there are unions that tend to project the interest of their members. And by that, they tend to stimulate the morale and the code of ethics within the workers. And the welfare of the workers becomes very relevant within the system of boosting the extent of productivity and the moral standard within the organization. In other words, for there to be productivity, there must be a high moral level. And that is why the British civil service is discussed here. That the civil servants themselves built this high moral and code of ethics that tends to enhance their levels of productivity within the system. So in other words, where the moral level is low, there is definitely going to be low levels of ethics and professionalism within such a system, and low productivity would be the end result of such a practice. So the relevance of the extent of the morale that is to be upheld within an organization to a large extent determines the extent of the successes that such an organization can be charged with, be it within the private system or in the public domain. As we are looking at the civil service today, the civil service in itself is a public institution that pilots the administrative aspect of every government. So the moral level, to a large extent, determines the extent of productivity and the successes that can be recorded within the system. Wholesome morale stimulates loyalty, cooperation, and teamwork, all of which are so essential for the smooth coordination of many individuals in a single organization. So you see the benefit that can be derived from improved morale, which is built within the extent of the welfare services that are available in such an organization to the staff of such an organization. There are other aspects that can also stimulate the morale level, but the central idea from all theories and all views and perspectives and the checklist of what boosts morale in an organization revolves around the extent of the welfare available to the personnel and staff of such an organization. So from the high points here, it is easy for one to discern that where there is high morale level, there is loyalty, there is cooperation, there is teamwork, and these are all essential for the smooth coordination of the organizations in themselves. We go to the next slide and say that the secret of the outstanding success of the British civil service is its high morale build-up by the civil servants themselves. So it means where there is high morale level, there is the tendency for more productivity and loyalty that can be stimulated amongst the workers in themselves. And that to a large extent enhances productivity. Meaning of morale. Morale is an inner possession of an individual or a group. In a simple term, It is the state of mind of an individual with respect to his work or environment. It is an attitude. In its individual form, morale is built up upon the opportunities to acquire distinction, prestige, and personal power, the right to be considered successful, respected, and an opportunity for personal self-development. So you see what makes up a morale within a working place or within a work environment. To a large extent, the extent of the prestige a worker is exposed to, the extent of the opportunities that are available, the extent of the interpersonal relationship that takes place within an organization to a large extent are stimulants of the levels of morale that can be found within the confines of an organization. In its group form, it sustains on attractive personal association, the easy adaptation to conditions in the organization, to habitual methods and attitudes of employees. A high group morale may help tide over face of depression of an employee who is perplexed and distressed by personal motives. So in other words, morale can even be measured from an individual level and from a group level as well. So in other words, from a group perspective, it can help an employee to overcome stress, to overcome other challenges that are of personal nature. So in other words, there must be a high level of morale in an organization for it to function effectively and for there to be productivity as it should be. So having said that, Marx believes that the highest morale has an intellectual quality results from emphasis upon information, understanding, and intercommunication, which rests in turn on genuine participation in institutional thinking, planning, deciding, and evaluating. These are dynamics of morale. So to a large extent, morale affects the levels of information that is handed down from the organization and how it is assimilated by the staff and communicated to the external environment as well. It therefore determines the levels of understanding, intercommunication, and other very salient features of the extent of the successes that can be recorded within an organization. In other words, the role of morale. Where there is high morale, there tend to be high productivity within the organization. Dimmock and Dimmock explain that morale is a byproduct, a combination of components which produces a balance and a healthy situation in which people may work with self-respect and with the opportunity for individual growth. So when you look at this definition given here, it therefore means that there is a healthy situation that takes place within the confines of an organization where the morale level is high, and also guarantees self-respect, and the opportunity for individual growth is also made available in an organization where the morale level is very high. So the relevance of the emphasis on morale as a stimulant to productivity within an organization cannot be overstated. Having said that, there are steps to build up morale, and we say that knowledge of the purpose and objective of the organization. Within this statement, it is easy for one to understand that the knowledge for the purpose of the establishment of the organization as well, to a large extent, determines the extent of the morale that workers can have. Like if you're in an organization where you don't belong there, or you don't have the feeling of sense of belonging within that organization, it is only normal for you to approach issues apathetically and without the zeal and the enthusiasm to work. So the level of morale that an individual gets is premised on the purpose and objectives of the organization and the extent to which he evaluates that arrangement to see if it fits in or if it's in tandem with his beliefs and practices within such an organization. It is important that the employee should have a knowledge of the purpose and objectives which the organization seeks to achieve and should be convinced of their social value so that he may sympathize with the objects he serves. So the extent of the involvement of an individual to a large extent determines the levels of morale that such an individual can have within the confines of such an organization. Confidence in his superior officers is another variable that can stimulate morale of the employees within an organization. Confidence in integrity and good intentions of the superior to a large extent stimulates the involvement and the participation of junior staff and the extent of the respect that is accorded to their superiors within the organization. The higher officers should be fair, impartial, hardworking, and honest. If the higher officers are corrupt, the fact will be spread throughout the organization and the morale of the employees are sapped. So the conduct of the superior to a large extent determines the levels of participation of the subordinates themselves. So where there is good conduct of superior officers, it is only normal for one to expect good conduct from subordinate staff, and by extension, there is productivity and vice versa. Involvement in the policy making and in running of the organization. I said earlier on that the extent of the involvement or the sense of belonging that the worker has within the confines of an organization to a large extent determines his levels of involvement and the levels of morale that he or she displays within the confines of that organization. So where there is an increased sense of belonging and participation, there is increased level of morale and increased productivity and input from the workers themselves. So a sense of participation in the policy making and running of the organization heightens the morale of the employee. They should be allowed to actively participate in the formulation of work programs. This will definitely boost their morale and sense of pride. In fact, the old concept of hierarchy and chain of command must give way for cooperation and partnership. Those in charge should be more of a leader than a boss. So imagine a system where junior rank or junior ranks of employees are allowed to make positive inputs within the organization. And they have the feeling of being attached to the roles that they play or the decisions that are taken in the organization. It is only normal for them to see such an organization as where their rights are protected and their interests are also protected, and they will do their best to ensure the sustainability of such an organization. So there should be involvement in the policy making and in the running of the organization by all and sundry. That to a large extent would enhance productivity and would enhance more commitment. So this is a very beautiful strategy of improving the morale of people within an organization or within a system. There is also stimulating leadership as one of the variables that help to build morale within an organization or a system. Stimulating leadership can greatly help in the building up of morale. Morale building in the organization is a continuous process and a responsibility for every manager. The chief executive should not hamper the growth of morale among employees. In other words, the leadership as well plays a very vital role in stimulating the extent of the morale that exists in the organization. Remember, we said earlier on that it is a feeling, an attitude that a worker has to work. The extent of his input is determinant or is premised on the extent of the morale that such an employee is exposed to. So for there to be maximum productivity and involvement of all, there must be a high level of morale in existence within the organization. So to a large extent, the role of morale is also premised on the role of the leadership within such an organization. Loyalty and devotion. Personnel loyalty also builds up morale in service. Successful higher officers inspire devotion among their subordinates. No hard and fast rule can be laid down to win his devotion because one officer will win it one way while another other way. However, the officer should behave in a manner as indicated previously so as to create confidence among the employees. So the aspect of the loyalty and devotion that comes from the leadership of the organization would also, by extension, command the extent of the loyalty and devotion to work by the subordinates. So it's a two-way traffic. In as much as there is the extent of leadership that can stimulate morale within the organization, there is also the arm of the role of the subordinates that is premised on the extent of the loyalty and devotion to work, as that to a large extent can promote morale within the organization. So if there is loyalty and devotion to work from the high-ranking personnel within the organization, it is only normal that it flows through the chain to the lowest rung of the ladder. And that to a large extent ensures total commitment and guarantees successes within the confines of the organization. So loyalty and devotion are very vital to in promoting morale within the organization. The next point is praise and recognition. When a worker does well, it is only normal for certain levels of praise and applaud to be given. And recognition as well plays a very vital role in stimulating the morale of the workers within the organization. So also, when a staff does wrong, the staff should be reprimanded for not doing the right thing. And when the staff does right, the staff should be praised. So in a system where there is that reward or recognition and appraisal of the roles of individual is one where the morale level would definitely be very high and the extent of the productivity would equally be high, as recognition and praise are boosters of morale within an organization. Morale rests upon recognition. It is human nature to crave for praise or recognition. When a civil servant has done a work of exceptional nature, he must get his due recognition and honor. In private enterprises, the employers accord recognition and the employer accorded recognition, and this would raise his morale. Thus, let it be remembered that morale is a very sensitive thing. So, like I said earlier on, when a person is applauded for outstanding performances within an organization, it is only normal for such a person to want to do more because the morale level has been increased. So where there is recognition, where there is appraisal, where there is positive appraisal, it is only normal that the extent of commitment and productivity would be at its highest levels. And such is healthy for an organization to grow and attain its objectives and principles. Having said that, we shall be looking at the civil service system and the levels of morale that exists within the system. The general civil service system is made up of career personnel who have tenure and who are administered according to traditional civil service practices. Its overriding characteristics are the emphasis that is placed on position, its description of duties, responsibilities, requirements, and qualification. As a public personnel system, the civil service has been the historic locus where of public administration, hence there is the need for high morale amongst the civil servants in the discharge of their duties. The civil service system values the notion of neutrality, merit, and being removed from politics. In fact, no activity of public administration can be performed today without civil servants. So you see the relevance of the civil service in the administration of the entire system. It is built around age-old practices that are subject to constant reforms and improvements. But however, certain aspects stands out, which is first the issues of merit, description of duties and responsibilities, the positions that civil servants occupy, and the extent of the morale that is in existence within the organization. So where the morale level is high, it is only normal for the civil servant to perform at its best. So all public administration can be performed today on the premise of the roles of the civil servant. So the civil servant to a large extent serves the purpose for the administration of the system in themselves. And for that to happen seamlessly with the highest levels of professionalism and utmost good faith, it must be premised on an improved and sustained level of morale by the personnel themselves. So the features of the civil service include the basic feature of the civil service, worth mentioning are as follows: professionalism, hierarchy, bureaucracy, impartiality, and anonymity. These are all attributes that guide the conduct of affairs within the civil service. And like we said earlier on, where the morale level is high, there tends to be high levels of professionalism, respect for authority and chain of command, impartiality, anonymity, neutrality, and confidentiality as well. So all these features are premised on the extent of the morale that an organization is charged with, or the civil service is charged with. So where there is high levels of morale, it is only normal for one to expect good conduct within such a system. So the function of the civil service includes advice to the government, program and operational planning of all government activities and programs, organization and methods that are to be carried out in the administration of all government policies and programs, even within the private sector. Administrative adjudicatory powers are all resides also within this civil service. Delegated legislative powers also resides within the confines of the civil service. And for all this to be carried out effectively, it revolves around the extent of the welfare and the morale that the staff of such a system are exposed to. So to a large extent, the civil service plays a very central role in the administration of the system in its entirety. So having said that, there are factors that affect the morale of the civil service. Like we said earlier on, where the morale level is high, there tends to be higher productivity. But where the morale level is low, then the levels of productivity and input is at its lowest ebb. And there are factors that stimulates the morale level, which we have discussed earlier on, to revolve around leadership skill, around loyalty and devotion, around involvement in policy making, around praise and recognition, and other very vital aspects that promotes morale building within an organization. So also there are factors that affect the morale of the civil service or that reduces the morale of the civil servant within an establishment. And we have said here, we have itemized a few of them by saying poor condition of service and welfare. Remember from the very beginning, we talked about the relevance of the welfare of the civil servant to be a determinant factor of the extent of his productivity and professionalism, and even confidentiality and utmost good faith that he maintains within the system. So where the condition of service is poor, where his welfare is not put into consideration, where the levels of his social interaction and even well-being as an individual is not put into consideration, is one that the moral level will definitely be low, and it will affect the levels of service and productivity within the system. There's also undue interference by the political class. We have seen systems where people have been promoted above their contemporaries by virtue of certain political interference. And that to a large extent dampens the moral level that should exist within the organization. Take for instance, it is a normal practice within the paramilitary and the military, where you have your contemporary assuming superior positions by virtue of special political interest. And that to a large extent hampers the extent of productivity within the system and reduces the level of morale of the staff of such a system. So undue interference is not a positive virtue that should be seen within the civil service, as it affects productivity, it affects the position that people occupy, it affects the extent of the commitment and the roles that people play within the system. Also, the spoil system against the merit system is another aspect that is in tandem with this undue interference. Like we discussed in our previous lectures, what the spoil system is as against what the merit system presupposes, we said that the spoil system is one where, by virtue of certain affiliations or certain a recognition or alignment, some persons are exposed to the benefits that ordinarily should accrue to all and sundry. So the spoil system guarantees a reward arrangement for certain individuals by virtue of their involvement either in politics or by recognition of their roles to a political system. So that to a large extent does not augur well within the confines of a civil service. Take for instance, somebody is brought from the outside a system and made the head of a department or a parastatal or an organization, as against those that have grown through the ranks and have put in many years of service. It's only normal for the level of morale within such a system to be dampened. But where there is merit, people are promoted on the premise of their qualification and their input in the system. By virtue of the number of years that they have put in service, it is only normal that such a system would be one where there will be increased productivity and general involvement and participation of all and sundry. So for there to be guaranteed upward progression within the system, the merit system must be upheld as against the spoil system. So in an organization where the spoil system reigns supreme is one where the moral level of those that have been in the organization and have grown in the organization will definitely be low. So the spoil system is not one that augurs well with the extent of the morale that should exist within the system. Corruption and abuse of power. This is the height of it all when one looks at the factors that affect the extent of the morale that civil service or the civil servant has within the confines of an organization. Where there is high levels of corruption and abuse of power, there will be very low morale of those, of the personnel and staff of such an organization. So corruption and abuse of power is one that tends to kill the extent of the productivity that ordinarily should take place within an organization. It affects and retards professionalism. It affects good conduct. It affects confidentiality. It affects even the levels of the hours of manpower that are injected into the system by virtue of the fact that where there is corruption and the system benefits a few, there will be apathy. There will be poor levels of involvement that would be seen in such a system. So due to the relevance of this very point, it is further buttressed in the following slide. Corruption in the public service. Corruption is a deliberate and intentional exploitation of one's position, status, or resources, directly or indirectly, for personal aggrandizement, whether in terms of material gain or enhancement of power, prestige, or influence, beyond what is legitimate or sanctioned by commonly accepted norms to the detriment of the interest of other persons or the community as a whole. So within the summation here made, it is only normal for one to discern that corruption to a large extent affects the levels of productivity owing to the fact that it is exploitational, it retards the extent of the involvement of people and the feeling of oneness that should exist or the interpersonal relationship that should guide the conduct of affairs within the organization. As all that would be at its lowest levels owing to the fact that people would naturally be withdrawn from a system that exhibits corruption and exploitation of the common good that should be available to all and sundry. So corruption is a deliberate and intentional exploitation of one's position, status, or resources, directly or indirectly, for personal aggrandizement, whether in terms of material gain or enhancement of power, prestige, or influence beyond what is legitimate or sanctioned by commonly accepted norms, to the detriment of the interest of other persons or the community as a whole. So in other words, corruption runs foul of the acceptable standard and the norms and values that ordinarily should exist within the system. So having said that, there are causes of corruption, and we have said that in all developing democracies, corruption has become a malady. The following are the main reasons for the rapid spread of corruption among the civil servants: historical causes, economic causes, sociological causes, lack of civil consciousness, political causes. All these are variables that one can measure the reason or the causes for corruption. Historical cause can be subsumed to mean age-old practices that depicts a reward to a few greedy persons within the system. So when that comes to play, people project them further and expect returns, as it is called in some organizations, or expect the handouts. And this, to a large extent, subjects the system to abuses. Economic gains or economic causes also, to a large extent, promotes corruption when one decides to pursue certain economic benefits that are not in tandem with the overall interest of the organization. Sociological causes. Within the Nigerian system, this can be understood as certain aspects where people say, okay, yes, he's a corrupt person, but he is of our ethnic origin. So because of the affiliations or the cultural a cover that an individual gets when a wrong practice is carried out, to a large extent, sustains corruption. because people will lay claim or make references to such practices and also hide within the confines of the divides that exist, the sociological divides that exist within the system, and are protected under such an arrangement. So lack of civil consciousness also subjects the system to corruption and political causes, where people are corrupt or politicians are charged with certain cases of corruption, and then you now see issues of cases being thrown out of court on the basis of technicalities or lack of technicality of whatever arrangement that comes up, or they are protected by certain political forces. All those things stimulate corruption and can be held as causes of corruption within the system. So in summary, we have said that corruption reached a climax soon after the attainment of independence in Nigeria. Charges of corruption have been leveled in almost all the states of Nigeria against the governors and other cabinet ministers, not only by the opposition political parties, but also the faction within the party itself. Thus, the acquisitive society must be replaced by a socialist society which should believe in equitable distribution of wealth, justice, and fairness. Widespread corruption is apt to be eliminated if the social attitude towards the institution of private property seeks such a transformation. In other words, even within the political system, there exists corruption. Within the civil service, there exists corruption. But for there to be any meaningful progress, corruption must be done away with and must be eliminated from the system, as it is a clog in the wheel of progress when one measures the extent to which successes should be recorded within the system in general. In conclusion, civil servant needs a boost in morale and a change in their work attitude if in the future the civil service is to be meaningful. The days are now gone when civil servants were a kind of terror to the common man. Civil servants are now the humble servants of the people who work for them and help in their welfare. That a change has come about in the lookout of civil servants cannot be denied, but still they have to go a long way to make the common people feel that civil servants exist for their welfare and prosperity, and that they would cooperate with the civil servants in the task of nation building. So in other words, where the moral level is high, there tend to be more productivity. And where corruption is at its lowest end, there tend to be a feeling of attachment and involvement by all and sundry, and the good of the land is equally distributed in the interest of the sustainability of the system. So the role of promoting a high level of morale within an organization is very important and pertinent to the survivability of the system and relevant in the extent of the productivity that is guaranteed within the system. So having said that, we have come to the end of this lecture, and I look forward to questions and contributions from members of the class as we make further progress, or as we meet in subsequent discussions. Thank you. Enjoy your